Okay, I'm going to kick things off here. Happy Thursday, everyone. Thank you for logging on for today's webinar, Lessons from Democratic Countries Abroad. This webinar is hosted by the Center for Election Innovation and Research with an assist from our wonderful friends at the Carter Center. My name is Joanie Greve, and I'm the Communications Specialist here at CEIR. Today's discussion is part of CEIR's new Trust Elections webinar series. As many of you know, CEIR is a nonpartisan nonprofit that works with election officials at the state and local level from around the country and from both sides of the aisle. We seek to support elections that voters should and do trust. Today, you will hear from David Becker, who is CEIR's Executive Director and founder. He has more than 25 years of experience in elections, having served as a senior attorney with the U.S. Department of Justice's voting section in both the Clinton and George W. Bush administrations. He also led the elections team at the Pew Charitable Trust prior to founding CEIR. You also hear from Paige Alexander, CEO of the Carter Center. Paige joined the Carter Center in 2020, and since that time, she has strengthened the center's core peace and health programs and led the organization in new directions, including adding programs to address the global mental health crisis, increasing political polarization in the US, and the impact of climate change on global peace and public health. Before joining the Carter Center, Paige had a distinguished career in global development with more than 2 decades of experience in the government and nonprofit sectors. She held Senate-confirmed senior leadership positions at 2 regional bureaus of the United States Agency for International Development, covering missions and development programs in 25 countries. I will hand the conversation over to David and Paige in just a moment, but first I'm going to cover a bit of housekeeping. Today's webinar is being recorded, and we will make that recording available after we conclude today. We'll have some time for questions at the end of David and Paige's discussion. At that point, I will ask you to please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to share your questions, and we'll try to answer as many as possible. And with that, I'll hand it over to David and Paige. Over to you guys.
Thanks, Joni. And thanks to all of you for joining us. I am just so pleased and honored to be joined by my really good friend, Paige Alexander, who's such an incredible force for good in the world and has really, over the last, what is it now, almost 6 years?
6 years.
Yeah, 6 years. Continued the amazing work of the Carter Center and expanded it out. And as we're facing this, what I think is really a unique moment in the United States, there's so much to learn about what other countries have dealt with as they face authoritarian movements and challenges to their democratic practices. And there's no organization that's been at the forefront of that like the Carter Center. So Paige, thank you for joining me. This is wonderful. For those of you who are just watching, like Paige and I could do this, just me and her talking for an hour or two, and we would enjoy it.
It's been going to happen a few times.
So you guys get to be a part of that conversation now and ask questions, which will keep us on track, which is really good. But Paige, if you could, am I right that today is the Hungary election?
It is day after tomorrow. I think, well, it's the next
It's this
2 or 3
week?
days. Yeah, it's
Okay,
this week.
so it's this week. And of course, Hungary is one of those countries that many kind of authoritarian figures here in the US look to for, as a model. And many of those of us who have been fighting to preserve our democracy look at as kind of the canary in the coal mine in many ways. And I don't want to talk just about Hungary, because I know that you do work all over the world, but can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing there and also what you're seeing in other places the Carter Center is working right now?
Sure. Well, I'll tell you, when President and Mrs. Carter set up the Carter Center in 1982, as they like to say when they were retired from the White House, or involuntarily retired, one of the things they really wanted to do was look at conflict resolution and human rights. And from that, we ended up growing and recognizing that election work is kind of the basis of democracy and how these countries are able to move forward. So as we veered into global health and some other pieces, it really comes down to human rights and conflict resolution. And as we started doing that work, we've now done elections, 128 elections in 40 different countries. And in 2020, we started looking at the US and said, when we have 5-hour lines in our backyard here in Fulton County, it's hard to justify us being in Venezuela and DRC and Peru and not looking locally. And so our work overseas has been in sort of the basic issues that you want to address when you're working on elections. You want to look at transparency, you want to look at inclusiveness, you want to ensure that elections are competitive, and that there's a clear mechanism to address elections when they don't go the way that the citizens think. And so those are things we've seen in 128 elections, and now we're seeing them here in the US a little bit. And those are the lessons that we're trying to bring back and forth.
Were you were were you and your staff hearing in countries that you were working back in, 2020, probably pre-COVID, and then since the kind of a dismissal of America being able to be an exporter of democracy because of perceived problems that we were experiencing here at home?
I think a lot of that was our own self-reflection, that it was going to be very hard to just keep doing this work overseas if we knew that we were walking into 2020 and we had then experienced 2020 in a way that other countries saw and were kind of scratching their head. It was a fascinating conversation I had with President Carter when I started, because I said, I don't know. I know that for 35 years, we had not done domestic work except for mental health. And did we need to start looking at domestic democracy issues? And he was very clear and said, there's one president at a time. And I try not to step on other presidents' toes. And I said, well, there are 5-hour lines in Fulton County. How can we be credible overseas? So it's with his permission that Jason Carter, who's the chair of our board, and I kind of decided that we were going to lean in domestically. And so we did that here in Georgia that first year. And then from that, we realized that there's like democracy resilience that needs to be set up. So now we're in 6 different states doing these democracy resilience networks. And that's kind of the core of what we saw in so many other countries as we worked on this. When people don't have the basic education, the basic education about elections, central election commissions overseas give you that education. Everything is in one place. Here in the United States, we have 9,000 separate jurisdictions for elections. And as you well know, those are just 2 totally different animals, but there are some similarities with how citizens partake in elections. And so that's the work that we're doing now.
And one of the things I was really, when we first started talking many years ago about this, and when the Carter Center got into domestic work in the United States, it focused on the expertise it had built up over so many years, specifically around election observation in many countries, and bringing that expertise that the Carter Center in particular had to first Georgia and then to other states. And that observation plays such an important role to both document what's going on and also make clear to all parties that this is going to be a transparent, open process, right? I mean, do you have have you seen anything in your work recently in any of the countries you've been working in that is particularly hopeful or particularly troubling?
Sure. Yeah, there's both hopeful and troubling. When you look at certain countries and you see how Gen Z has come up and started participating in elections, whether it was Bangladesh, we've seen this in numerous countries, and youth involvement is incredibly important. At the same time, youth involvement is easily swayed often by people who are seeing things online. And so it's hard to disprove a negative. And so when someone sees a 30-second TikTok or a social media clip, they walk away thinking that's real. And so the education piece of it is something, we had back in the day, for those of us who remember Schoolhouse Rocks, I remember so much about how a bill becomes a law based on Schoolhouse Rock because you have these viral videos. Well, that's the same thing that's happening now, but they're misinformation and disinformation. And so I think we started seeing that just back in 2016, we started seeing a lot of the digital tools that were being used for mis and disinformation. And a conversation I had with President Carter about bots, for example. I was trying to explain to him why situations were different now during elections. And I was talking about bots. And he said, I don't know what you're talking about. And I was like, you're in your 90s, I'm in my 50s. We are probably not going to.
But he was a nuclear engineer, if memory serves, also an incredibly well-educated man.
Absolutely.
But still, that's how difficult it is to conceive of the stuff that people are dealing with right now, right?
Right. And I said, it's as if someone put up a poster on a ladder that was, an 8-foot ladder, and then destroyed the latter. And you had these posters all over town that people were just seeing. They were just out there constantly coming at you, and you couldn't take them down. So he started to understand how the environment, the ecosystem had changed. And we've seen that it started, to be honest, we started seeing it in Europe, and then we've seen the bad actors continue to play.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point because one of the things I came into this work from a different angle because I started in the domestic side and worked solely on US elections, the Justice Department, and then at Pew and now at the Center for Election Innovation and Research. And what I experienced when I would go overseas or when I met people from other countries is there was generally a view, both from Americans and other countries, that Americans didn't have much to teach the rest of the world, and the rest of the world didn't have much to teach us with regard to democracy. And some of that wasn't just kind of jingoistic, chest beating. Some of it was actually based on reality. I mean, if you look at our elections in the United States are more complex and decentralized than any other country. I think you've probably seen that. You mentioned central election commissions,
Right.
which is how most countries run their elections through some kind of centralized body. And we don't have anything even remotely close to that in the United States. We have nearly 10,000 election jurisdictions. We have 50 states. The states are charged with coming up with their own regulations around elections. The ballots look different, and even and one of the things that I think really shocks people from overseas is how many races, how many contests are on our ballots. Because usually, not always, but in most countries, ballots are fairly simple, one or two races per election in many cases. There might be a few more. As people listening to this know, it's not uncommon to have 50, 75, or 100 contests on an American ballot, right? That really isn't seen almost anywhere in the world. And so previously, when I'd go and talk about American elections and see if people would want to be interested in other countries, be interested in us, they'd say, no, 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 thanks. We don't need that. And vice versa from here in America, if people would come and talk to us. But I think the disinformation landscape has changed that because that disinformation challenge is something we're all facing in especially the world's established democracies, right? I mean, that struck me. What we saw in 2016 was something that we saw a little bit earlier with Brexit, that we saw earlier in some of the European elections, and that is something that the established democracies of the world really share as a challenge.
Yeah, and without a doubt, when you look at all the different ways elections are run, from proportional representation to first past the post to majoritarian system or a mixed system, it's hard for us to teach what we are doing because every system is quite different. In Ireland, they have this opportunity to do essentially a ranked choice voting. And when you've got, in so many countries, 59 party list democracies with proportional representation, it's between the voters and the seats that they're able to, have that proportional representation. It's just very different. And so you have to go into every situation and every, as they say, all politics is local, all development is local. And you mix those two for elections, and you have to recognize what people are seeing. Are they seeing a huge list, or are they just seeing one or two votes? And that's very different. Peru this weekend, they vote on Sunday. It's really nice when countries get to vote on the weekend or on holidays, or a whole country calls for a holiday so people show up. And it's also questionable about mandatory voting. What a great thing to have mandatory voting because people show up, but they have to be educated. So all of that kind of fits into the leveling of how the US goes into another country and says, this is what you should be doing.
I mean, one of the things that strikes me about the disinformation challenges that we all share is a lot of folks focus on the more campaign-oriented disinformation, saying weird things, false things about candidates or what they might do. In my work, and probably to some degree in yours, the disinformation I'm most concerned about is the disinformation about how voters can participate in the process. We used to have the old these very crude manipulations where people would spread flyers out in minority neighborhoods, for instance, saying, Republicans vote on Tuesday, Democrats vote on Wednesday. clear disinformation. Flyers are very clunky and not very effective. But now you can have really highly targeted disinformation that might tell people that mail ballots need to be in by one date, and when they're not, tell them to go to the wrong polling place, tell them, all kinds of different things that might invalidate their ballot or make them not want to cast a ballot. And then also a second bucket of disinformation that I think that we see worldwide in established democracies is the disinformation that is spread saying the losing candidate didn't actually lose. And there's reasons that you should distrust the process itself, distrust your fellow countrymen who might have just preferred another candidate, and in an effort to delegitimize the winner of the election. I think in the US, one of the things that was most striking in 2016, which is when we really saw a huge pickup of this, is so much of the disinformation was spread anticipating that Secretary Clinton was going to win that election. Almost everyone thought she was. And it was spread in such a way to delegitimize her eventual victory. And then there was almost this period of time where those who were spreading disinformation, mainly from foreign adversaries, Russia, we know for sure, China to some degree, Iran, others, they almost didn't know what to do for a period of time because the outcome was not what they had planned for. And some of them still spread disinformation and just flipped it and started spreading disinformation that Donald Trump hadn't actually won it, because our foreign adversaries really benefit when we are paralyzed by doubt about who's in charge in our democracy.
Yeah, without a doubt. And then we take the bait.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a really important issue that I think that we as educated people who are out there trying to educate voters, not about a particular party or a particular candidate, but about the fairness and the transparency of the election, we can't take the bait. I mean, you had a great comment when the EO came out. You were like, this really, there's no there. This is illegal. And
Right.
people were running around saying, what are we going to do about this? But at the end of the day, the court system will take care of some of this. And we have to make sure that we don't take the bait. We don't, go off at every tweet and every EO that comes out. I mean, there are over 500 lawsuits pending now, obviously, and a lot of them are election related. And our states individually have
Yeah.
a lot of those going about voter lists. And, in Fulton County, again, sitting in Fulton County, I will tell you it's difficult as we look at things that got teed up here, but you can't take the bait. You just stick to the facts.
You're segueing exactly to where I think we're going to go, which is the kind of more United States focused stuff. But one of the things that strikes me, I was asked by a reporter recently on a podcast or something, what is the biggest weak spot in American elections? And to your point, it's not the voting machines, it's not the voter registration lists, it's this.
Right.
The weakest spot in our elections is our own mind. The easiest way to suppress a vote is not through some kind of voter purge, which doesn't really happen to the degree people think it does. It's not through some kind of ICE is not going to be at the polls. We're going to talk about that probably, that it's just not going to happen at any kind of scale. If it happens once, it's going to get blocked right away. But the easiest way to suppress a vote is to get the voter to suppress themselves. And by making them think that voting is going to be unsafe or inconvenient or it's not going to matter. And we've seen people mostly on one side of the political spectrum, but not exclusively on one side of the political spectrum, try to do that. And it's one of the reasons back in 2016, when we first started seeing the ramped up foreign interference in our elections, there have been very, very few instances, maybe two, where foreign adversaries actually somehow interfered with actual election infrastructure in the United States. And the most prominent example of that in 2016, the Russian GRU had access to the Illinois voter registration database and were sitting in there undetected for about 3 weeks, just kind of very quietly looking at stuff. They hadn't changed anything, they didn't do anything. And after 3 weeks, they all of a sudden turned the volume up to 11 and they started accessing huge volumes of data, which was instantly noticed. Couldn't have not been noticed, and Illinois shut down access to their database to make sure it wouldn't continue and fixed it. It had no impact on the election. Nothing was changed. If someone is going to try to impact a presidential election, would you target Illinois? No, you wouldn't target Illinois, right? But people have asked, why did the Russians all of a sudden ramp up their activity when they were going to be noticed when they did that? And the reason was because they wanted to be noticed. They wanted Americans to worry that our system had been hacked. So when people hear hard left activists say our voting machines aren't secure, or hard right-wing activists say our voting machines aren't secure, our mail balloting isn't secure, or there are non-citizens on the voter list, what they're doing is the same. That's the same exact type of tactic that we saw from the Russians and others, trying to get us to distrust a system that is inherently more trustworthy than it's ever been.
Right. And people buy into that. And that is the biggest concern we have. Mail-in voting. I'll use an example that is near and dear to our heart because President Carter and Secretary Baker did a report in 2005 that talked about mail-in voting. And we know now that it works. But yes, 16 years ago, there was a serious question as to whether or not those were 16. I was like, sorry, I'm losing, my math is bad. 20 years ago, 21, there was a serious question about whether or not that mail-in voting could work. Well, Portland has proved that, Oregon's proved that mail-in voting works. We now know 28 states are able to use non-excused vote by absentee ballots. But if people are being told that it's going to be fraudulent, I look at Heritage. Heritage had a report that they did covering from 1982 to 2025. They estimated that 0.00009% or 6% of the vote was fraudulent. And there was a similar report from Brookings too in 2025 that 0.0000043% of the vote was fraudulent. When that teeny bit of fraudulent becomes the story, you know that you're in trouble. And so we have to be able to push back. Yes, I would like to vote in person because that's the way I do it, but my 91-year-old mother might need to do the mail-in ballot, and I want to make sure it is actually the right mail-in ballot because, as you were saying, my parents got numerous mail-in ballots that I knew were not legitimate. So some of that stuff is worrisome.
I mean, we're seeing now our foreign adversaries no longer need to create the content because so much is created domestically here that they can just amplify. And to your point, that Heritage database, which has been around since I've been working in elections for 30 years, that Heritage has been collecting that data, like you said, since the early 80s. They're literally over the pool of votes that have occurred in the United States during their collection of data is well into the billions and perhaps tens of billions. And the total number of potential, not even confirmed fraud cases, potential fraud cases that Heritage, who is highly incentivized to try to maximize the fraud, because a lot of their policies come from that direction, is 1,000 out of billions and billions of votes cast. It really is actually a testament to how well the election workers and the states managed elections. I mean, you see this in Georgia where, there's a lot of partisan gamesmanship about what's happening in Georgia. But you and I both work with Georgia election officials on both sides of the aisle. And Georgia runs really good elections, quite frankly. Very high turnout, very high registration rates. Although there were those long lines that you saw back,
that was during the primary in 2020. By the general, in the middle of COVID, 5.3 million Georgians voted. And the election administrators here were smart enough to announce the risk limiting audit ahead of time and say, we're going to be hand counting this because they're not little men in the machine changing your QR code. And we did a report that showed in Fulton County that literally less than 1/100% was the difference, the variation between the QR code and the handwritten. And I was in a couple of different places, counties, looking at this, and I saw what that 1/100% was. It was, someone who had written in and then it had been put into a QR code. So it is just unbelievable to me on so many levels that we're still relitigating 2020 here in Georgia when it was actually counted, recounted, and recounted.
Yeah.
And we were part of that.
And I'm really grateful. I mean, a lot of it is the work I hope that our two organizations do, but also the grown-ups on both sides of the aisle in places like the Secretary of State's office and the county election offices who've tried to put some of the extreme partisan noise aside and just rolled up their sleeves and gotten this stuff done. And by the way, that's true in so many of the states, including the other states that the Carter Center is currently. And we work nationwide. I mean, so much of the disinformation that affects our elections, and is probably similar disinformation overseas, is based on, as you put it, these this amplification, this elevation of the fact that our elections aren't perfect. They're not designed to be perfect. An election
Right.
in the United States is an election where 150, it's an event where 150 million people in the United States do something they hardly ever do in a process run by millions of volunteers in 10,000 different jurisdictions. And it is designed with the idea that there is going to be human error. That's why we don't certify elections on election night. We need to check and double check and reconcile and, audit and recount and do all of those things to make sure we got it right. Georgia does it in about a week and a half to 2 weeks. Other states take a little more time, but our process is designed with the idea that there will be human error, and we're going to fix it before it has any impact on the outcome, thanks to all the checks and balances we have. And yet you see these deniers, these conspiracy theorists, who make false claims about non-citizen voting. We know how much non-citizen voting there is in the United States. It's not zero. It's very close to zero. I might have Joanie put up a link to reports we've done on this, where states have often, for political reasons, put out claims that there were large numbers of non-citizens prior to an election, and then after the election's over, they quietly say, "Oh, actually, we looked into this and we found hardly any of them." Right?
Right. But
Georgia,
by that time, they've created the noise.
exactly.
So,
Georgia, again, all credit to the election officials there on both sides of the aisle. Georgia did this responsibly. And before they put out the inflated numbers, they checked them first. And I think they
right.
came up with I think there were like 20 people out of 8 million in Georgia that were possible non-citizens. No one wants non-citizens on the list. But there's a
Yeah.
responsible way to do that. The mail voting stuff, which we've already talked about, and I think maybe we'll transition to the executive order now, because I know that's on people's minds. And of course, the voting machine claims, which Georgia again has been ground zero for, and where both left and right have spread false claims about the trustworthiness of the machines, the degree to which the audits are sufficient. The answer is they're trustworthy and the audits are sufficient, but
How many audits do you need?
exactly. I
It's,
mean, that risk limiting audit you talked about
yeah.
in Georgia in November, is the highest form of audit. And they just decided, instead of picking out a sampling of a third of the ballots and counting them, they counted every single paper ballot there in the presidential race by hand in
Yeah.
5 days, 5.3 million, as you point out. Like, that's amazing. During COVID. I mean,
During COVID,
I
that
mean,
was,
like you guys were on the ground there. You saw what was going on. I mean, the diligence of these election officials and these workers throughout the state of Georgia, we all owe a debt to them.
absolutely. I try to explain to people when you're observing, when you're monitoring an election, it's kind of like watching paint dry, because watching people vote and then a recount, I mean, that is truly like watching paint dry. You're holding up a piece of paper and saying the person's name, handing it to the person next to you, they're putting it in a pile, then they're counting it out every 10. It was 5 days of what is otherwise incredibly boring,
Drudgery.
tedious work.
Yeah.
And these people were coming in the middle of COVID and doing it. And yet and there was transparency. There were poll watcher, there were party affiliated groups watching. We were the only nonpartisan at the time, but it was fascinating to me that somehow people think this process could be undone by, 5.3 million votes could be undone by whatever guidance they were given or whatever they saw online about a box of votes. And I appreciate everyone coming to watch it. And that's because everything is local. People have to come to their local level and participate, not just voting, but being workers, poll watchers. All of that's important because our administrators are out there doing the hard work.
Yeah. And back to that paper ballot point, Georgia, for those of you that don't live and breathe this stuff every day like we do, or spend a lot of time in Georgia. Paige spends more time in Georgia than I do, but I spend a decent amount there. Georgia had not had paper ballots since 2000. So it was 2 decades without paper ballots. They had purely digital ballots. And thanks to the leadership of the legislature and the Secretary of State's office in 2018 and 2019, they started the process of making sure they had paper ballots for 2020. So those recounts and those audits were only possible because of the foresight of officials in the state of Georgia to move in that direction. And that's a trend we've seen nationwide, by the way. For all this talk about voting machines, we're not trusting the voting machines. We are moving to paper ballots that allow us to confirm that the voting machines operated properly, not even worried so much that they've been hacked, but they could malfunction, of course. Any device could. And so right now in the United States, 98% of all paper ballots, all ballots are paper, with the only exception being the state of Louisiana, which is trying to move to paper. It won't get there by 2026, but it'll get there soon. So every swing state, every state we're talking about, with the exception of Louisiana, paper ballots, auditing those ballots, confirming the machines are counting properly. And yet back to your point, Paige, we're still going to hear losing candidates amplified by foreign adversaries spread lies about what the voting machines have done. And we'll hear that in 2026 for sure.
Right. You go from QR codes to paper ballots, like, questioning the little men in the machine, changing the QR code. Then you go to the paper ballot. Okay, now we have paper ballot. But now that first EO was on handwritten, that there would have to be handwritten ballots. And having watched people who handwrite things, that's a disaster. And so, balancing this, no system is going to be perfect, but here in Georgia, we have as close to perfect as you could possibly be, because we've got both that and the backup paper.
Totally agree. I mean, I think there are lots of states that are in that top group with Georgia, more than people expect. But I've often said, if elections were run throughout the United States like Georgia, we'd be fine. There are folks probably on both sides of the aisle that probably would argue with me about that. But I'll tell you, having worked all across the country, that's generally true. But again, all of the states, our voter lists are more accurate. Early voting is accessible in 47 states. Mail voting is accessible in 38 states without an excuse. Every state has paper ballots with the exception of Louisiana. Every state audits those ballots. So again, back to the point, our elections are more trustworthy than ever before, and yet we continue to see disinformation and disinformation fueled legislation or rulemaking. And I think there's a good point to transition to the executive order, since it's the most recent thing that happened. This is the second executive order that this president has signed. The first one was signed almost exactly a year ago, and it sought to dictate to the states policies with regard to proof of citizenship, policies with regard to when they could accept mail ballots, and policies with regard to what voting machines they could use. And that was almost immediately challenged in court. And 3 different federal courts blocked it pretty much in its entirety. It has no effect right now because the Constitution of the United States has the Elections Clause, Article 1, Section 4, that says the state legislatures get to make the rules. The Congress can also make rules expressly for federal elections, but the one person who doesn't have any power over that is the president. And the president can't just do that with the, signing of a Sharpie. And so what happened in last week was the president signed a new executive order. This was focused predominantly on mail voting. And for the first time in American history, he sought to tell DHS to create a national citizen/voter list. He then tries to order the Postal Service to get the states to share their voter lists with the Postal Service, and they will get the DHS list, and the U.S. Postal Service is prohibited from mailing a ballot to anyone who isn't on the DHS blessed list of voters. And even tells the Postal Service to start redesigning state mail ballot envelopes, which is something that the states have a lot of experience with and the Postal Service has no experience with. And as I said at the time, and you alluded to this, Paige, election officials, voters, everyone should not worry about this at all. There's plenty of other things to worry about. There's a lot going on. Primaries are happening right now. This is never going to become law. Clearly unconstitutional, clearly violates several laws that Congress has already passed, like the National Voter Registration Act and the Privacy Act. And it's never going to go into effect. And in fact, that was signed March 31st. Between April 1st and April 3rd, which is Wednesday through Friday of last week, 5 different lawsuits were filed by a variety of entities. The Democrats filed one, some groups filed some, and also 23 states and DC filed one up in Massachusetts. They're currently in two different courts. One's in Massachusetts, one group is in Massachusetts, one's in DC. The DC court case is on a fast track. The judge who is hearing that case is the same judge who blocked the first executive order, and the first filings are going to happen tomorrow, where the plaintiffs are going to file for a preliminary injunction. So, I do think, and you kind of alluded to this too, there is this tactic, I don't know if it's intentionally used or unintentionally used, often by authoritarians, to kind of overwhelm us all, to put the fire hose of turn the
Shock and
fire hose
awe.
of BS on us, and so the executive order and the DOJ lawsuits to try to seize voter data, which are losing at record rates in court, the seizure of the 2020 election ballots and other information in Fulton County, comments made by Justice Department officials and White House officials and the Director of National Intelligence about our elections. Those are all meant to overwhelm us to the point where we have no, election officials in particular don't feel like they're on solid ground about a lot
Right.
of this stuff. And so it's really important, to note we are on solid ground. We just had elections this week in Wisconsin and Georgia that went very well.
Right.
Not from a perspective of who won, from a perspective of how the election process actually worked. The Texas primary had some challenges, but those election officials navigated them and had record high turnout. We're seeing very high turnout in some of these others. So I think it's, I think we have to just keep our eye on the ball, because we're going to continue to hear disinformation as this season progresses.
Right. I think all of this is flying at us, whether it's executive orders or whether it's the current president name checking my guy, President Carter, from the White House and saying that we've misrepresent that somehow mail-in voting is not legitimate, and then he turns around and votes by mail. You find this. We've got a lot of systems that have been put in place that are guardrails. And for right now, with these lawsuits that you're mentioning, that's the legal system. Those are guardrails for questioning the Constitution. From my perspective, we've got to lower the temperature. It's hard to disprove a negative, but if we lower the temperature and don't jump at everything that comes flying at us, as you said, that is the key of authoritarianism, when so much is performative. They say so many negative things, and when it gets overturned, then they can point back and say, well, I mentioned this 2 years ago, or I mentioned this 6 years ago, I mentioned it 4 years ago, and I was turned away. And we all jump at that. We're like, oh, that was right. That was mentioned. We have to just be very careful to focus on the goal, which is the transparency of elections, how we ensure that we are walking into a system that works, that is fully functioning, and that gives people, the cornerstone of our work is the cornerstone of America and democracy is universal suffrage. If you make it harder for people to vote, then people just aren't going to show up. And that's also one of those issues that pushes down the people feeling that they're empowered. And so we have to be really clear about how you work on public education, how you work on the systems, how you make sure that legal takes care of legal, and the rest of us take care of ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right. One other, I think we're going to go to questions in a second, because there's been quite a few that have been put up as we've been talking. But something else some folks might be interested in or thinking about is there is this Supreme Court case. There's a couple of Supreme Court cases that could have big impacts. One is, and I'll just mention them very briefly. One is the Callais case, which is challenging the constitutionality of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which is really one of the last remaining powerful Voting Rights Act tools that the Supreme Court hasn't dismantled. And that's been pending since last fall, and we still don't have a court opinion on that. I think most of us on this podcast probably, or on this webinar, feel pretty passionately about the Voting Rights Act. I certainly do, having enforced it for many years. And it would be a shame if it were weakened again by the Supreme Court, because clearly it's not in violation of the Constitution. It's actually the act that gives meaning to the 14th and 15th Amendments of the Constitution. But if the court weakens or invalidates Section 2, we could see weird things like redistrictings, because there will no longer be some of the boundaries of the Voting Rights Act applying. That's one thing. The second one that could be much more impactful in 2026 in some ways is the RNC versus Watson case, which is about whether or not states can offer extended periods for their mail ballots to come in after Election Day,
Right.
as long as they've been voted on or before Election Day. That was heard recently, and I expect the decision will come in June. There have been some people who think the Supreme Court's going one way or the other. I've heard some pessimism that the Supreme Court might invalidate these extended periods. I listened to the argument. I think it's really hard to read the tea leaves on this, so it's not clear. But if you're in one of those 14 states that allows for extended periods, in other words, you could vote a ballot, but put it in the mailbox by Election Day, and if it arrives a few days later, it'll still get counted. If the Supreme Court doesn't or says that violates the Constitution or existing congressional law, which I think is the wrong call, but they might, then there's going to be voters are going to need to be educated about that and find other ways to make sure anyone listening to this, mail voting is fine. If you want to vote by mail, if that's the most convenient, accessible method of voting for you, you should absolutely use it, but you should never put a voted ballot in the mail after about 10 days before the election. If you still hold that mail ballot about 10 days before the election, either find a drop box or an election office to turn it into, or bring it with you and vote in person, preferably early, because there's just too many variables that might be around the mail ballot return at that point in time. That's what I'd advise.
Yeah, and then so many, I mean, I will ask a question. I know we're going to go to questions, but in those 14, I'm curious, do they have early voting in all of those states?
All of them do.
All of
Yeah.
them. So this is, we're just back to education. We're really just back to education. Like the best thing you could see, and we have talked about this, is the first day of early voting to see long lines. That tells you everything you need to know about people taking this into account and saying, I'm going to get in, I'm going to cast my vote in person. There's nothing better than that. And, we're in Georgia, it's fortunate that in many ways after COVID that we ended up with some of these things ingrained in how we vote, that we've got this early voting. We have drop boxes. But when you make fewer drop boxes, then of course everyone's going to yell. And I understand that you've given us rights and then you've taken things away. We still have so much more now than we did in 2016.
Yeah.
So
I think, we just put up a quick 60-second Center for Election Innovation and Research, quick 60-second video on the history of mail voting. People should check it out. We're on Instagram, TikTok, I'm told. I don't have a TikTok account. LinkedIn, Blue Sky, check it out. But
we'll push that out too, because it was good.
One of the things that I think people might not realize, especially people who didn't have a lot of experience with mail voting, is prior to 2020, mail voting had no partisan preference or impact whatsoever. Republicans might have even embraced it a little more, especially older property owning rural voters really relied upon mail voting. And, if you think about it, that's what probably voters the Republican Party thinks are inclined to vote for Republicans. And it wasn't until 2020 when the president started bad-mouthing mail voting for the first time that we saw this partisan skew. And it worked both ways. I mean, Republicans stopped voting by mail because the president told them it was bad. And then Democrats who opposed President Trump started thinking they should do vote by mail just because the president hated it. And it'd be great to get back to the position where everyone just goes back and says, hey, is this the way the most convenient way for me to vote? Because what a lot of people will find, and I think you and I are the same on this, my favorite way of voting is early in person. It is, you get to see other voters, you get to see the poll workers there, you get to thank them, you get to be part of your community. And this is really important, especially as there's been disinformation about how ballots are counted and who's ahead at what time. Early in-person votes in almost every state, not every state, but almost every state, are among the very first ballots to be reported out. So if that's important to you, it's a great way of making sure your ballot is not only done and you don't have to worry about it on election day, but it's probably going to be reported out first thing on election night as soon as the polls close. And I see Joanie just put a link to the LinkedIn posting from the explainer video, so hopefully people go on there. Paige,
so let's go to questions.
Should we hit some questions?
That'd be great.
First question is, 2026 has been a challenging year in a lot of ways, and many of us working on elections have been under increased scrutiny, pressure, and stress dating as far back as 2020. What would you say to election officials who may be feeling burnt out and disheartened and maybe questioning whether they should continue in this profession? That is a heartbreaking and completely accurate question.
I was just in Colorado talking to Secretary of State's office up there and all the people working there who were working with election administrators too. It's a heartbreaking statement. I think all of us feel that we are not on solid ground, and what we can do to help those folks in particular, especially someone asking this question, is be positive about the work that they are doing. Make sure that other people in our community know that people are doing this work, to be good citizens. We have to help lower the temperature. We have to help get to the truth. Again, separating fact and fiction is very difficult, but refraining from the rhetoric that people often have about pointing fingers. And so just know how appreciated you are, because you are the backbone of our democracy. And without you, this couldn't be happening. And so taking the hits and making sure that other people out there who are not doing the job are there to support you is exactly what we at the Carter Center, I think, what CEIR wants to do as well.
Yeah, I host monthly webinars just for election officials. No one else. This is not for press. This is not for any kind of attention. These are monthly webinars I've been holding since March for election officials. We're getting hundreds of election officials from almost every state on these webinars. I held 2 last week because we had an extra one because of the executive order. And first, I think we will continue to work with the media and the public, as Carter Center does, to kind of lay things out, be straight shooters, and explain things out, and cut through that fire hose of BS that is occupying so much of our discussion. But we're also going to bring tools. I mean, I think the Carter Center's observation provides a really important tool.
And our mental health resource guide.
Oh,
our mental health resource guide for election administrators also is online.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, and maybe we can get that up in the chat, or with the follow-up email, we'll definitely include a link to that. That's really important. But we also, CEIR runs the Election Official Legal Defense Network, EOLDN.org. If any election official anywhere and around the country needs an advice or assistance from a lawyer, they can put in a request through EOLDN.org, and they'll get paired with an attorney who will help them for free, no cost to them. And we are seeing more requests than ever right now because of that environment that the questioner kind of talked about. We're now 6 years past the 2020 election, and it's still happening. So we will provide that help for you. Look, there are organizations like our 2 organizations. There are many, many Americans out there who appreciate you and have your back. We are going to be there through all of this. We cannot have a democracy without the professionals, without the civil servants who do the work that you all do. And that is absolutely nonpartisan. In my experience, the Republicans are facing at least as much abuse, threats, and harassment as the Democrats in the current environment. And I hope we get to the point where we don't need to provide those kind of support and resources for you anymore, because we've once again kind of restored sanity, and you can retreat back into the anonymity that I heard complaints about, where people didn't even know what the hell you did, and you couldn't possibly explain it to folks. And I see Joanie just included the mental health resource guide.
Yes, thank you for that.
This one's probably more for you, Paige. What lessons can be shared from other countries to help election officials in particular administer elections this year?
So staying the course. I mean, that is people showing up and you recruiting other people to help you do it. From other situations, we look at the transparency of the election, poll watchers, making sure that you are inclusive of and opening to poll watchers. I think we found that in foreign countries has been sometimes the tipping point between what a hired civil servant says and what an international observer says. It's hard to put my finger on a specific lesson learned, because what you all are doing and what America was supposed to stand for is the most transparent, open election process. And now that when I look at other places, the press, bringing the press in, you all can't talk to the press, but we can. And so when you have organizations like us, like what David is doing too, making sure that we're clarifying those pieces. But it's a lot to try to make those comparisons, and I can't do it in a short period of time, but I'm happy to follow up. Whoever asked that, they can reach out to us.
And I just had one quick point,
Yeah.
because as we mentioned before, many other countries have more centralized election authority. One of the advantages I think we have, I don't know if you design this from scratch. I'm not saying central is bad and decentralized is good or vice versa, but decentralization does come with a lot of security advantages. It is effectively impossible to steal a national election in the United States, because you're not stealing one national election. You'd have to steal 10,000 little elections all over the country. So one thing I'd say to election officials is not only support your work, but put your work in context with all of the other jurisdictions in your state nationwide. And you do such a good job of this. Every time I talk to election officials, I've rarely seen an election official throw another jurisdiction under the bus. But the work, I know this from talking to folks in states that aren't Georgia and Arizona and Wisconsin. They will constantly tell me that they're election deniers, they're conspiracy theorists, the citizens who've been, fed this toxic diet of lies will often say, well, maybe I trust you, but I don't trust what's happening in these other states where, shenanigans are up. And so my big lesson is you are all in this together. You never know when it's going to be that you have a very close election where the loser doesn't accept it. And what I have seen time and time again is election officials across the country standing up for each other, regardless of party, regardless of state. And I think that's really key. It's one of the reasons we've gotten through this to this point.
Yeah, and I will say again, overseas, when you look at what we did in, who we've worked with in Liberia and Democratic Republic of Congo and Venezuela, when you have citizen observers, they speak volumes for you. If they have seen the actas, if they have seen the poll result, not the poll results, but the actual results being posted on the door of the window, and they're taking pictures, use civil society in a positive way, because I think that they can help elevate and scale the message of transparency. And so that's also a piece that I see getting shut down here in the United States, as everyone worries about their own 501c3 registration. Like, will we even be around to do this? I really hope that the election administrators are inclusive when they can be of civil society, because that's where the education comes from. If there's not a central election commission telling you how to run something, then you just have a lot of noise out there. The civil society and nonprofits that are doing this work are doing it to help the system remain transparent.
I think that's exactly right. And most I know are have worked actively to maintain really good relationships. I'll also say, I'll put on a little pitch. We're going to be releasing very soon a report, and I really think it's the first report that I've ever seen, as incredible as this is, about what the real voter registration rate in the United States is, and across and in certain states. This data has been hard to get. The research team at CEIR has done an amazing job. We're releasing it very soon. And the good news actually is, in most states, the voter registration rate is really, it's higher than I expected it to be. That we actually, this idea that it's hard to register, we've put research out on this, and Joanie will include some of this in the follow-up, that shows innovative methods of registration are reaching more voters. Online voter registration, same-day registration, automatic voter registration are reaching more voters than ever before. And it's not just in blue states. Georgia, as Paige knows, has probably maybe the best automatic voter registration system in the country.
Our guys started it and registered, putting it in high schools. You turn 18 and you get registered.
I mean, it's remarkable. And Georgia has one of the highest voter registration rates in the country as a result. So like the barriers that are often perceived to kind of gin up discontent might not be as bad as you think. By the way, there are some states that are not as good as Georgia. I don't want to suggest that everything is perfect and we don't need to keep working on this. We absolutely need to keep working on this. But the news is often better than you think. And I think that's one of the reasons we're seeing such high turnout rates. The next question, and I'm happy to start with this and let you follow up if you want, it's about Fulton County. President Trump has repeatedly claimed the 2020 election was stolen and has zeroed in on the state of Georgia as ground zero for those claims, authorizing an FBI raid on the Central Elections Office in Fulton County. What is the Carter Center's and CEIR's perspective on this? CEIR has been pretty public on this. I've personally been pretty public on this. as soon as the affidavit from the FBI agent came out, it was very clear that it was deficient. It didn't identify, it didn't claim that there was intent to commit a crime, which is an absolute element. It didn't identify any foreign interference, which makes you wonder why the Director of National Intelligence was there. It it clearly was after the 5 year statute of limitations, and it didn't even mention the statute of limitations. And finally, it didn't even identify a crime, let alone a criminal. It basically admitted there was no evidence of election theft. There was no evidence of any change to the outcome. And so that warrant should never have been signed off on by a magistrate. And of course, Fulton County is now trying to get its stuff back. It has a very high legal burden to try to do that, unfortunately. But I can say with almost certainty, there's no way the DOJ is going to find a crime or prosecute a crime and bring any of that evidence into court because they've got real problems on all of those aspects. It is likely that this law enforcement tool, this incredibly powerful law enforcement tool of a warrant, was being used not for law enforcement by the DOJ, but to push out more disinformation about elections, probably targeted at 2026.
Yeah, and I'll just, the only addition to that is the performative nature of doing something like that
Yeah.
and having Tulsi Gabbard, in the corner, making us all think this was going to be a national security concern, and maybe that's what they had a undercurrent of a warrant. My vote is sitting in those ballots that have been taken away from Fulton County. Those have been counted, recounted. They were only being stored because they're still on, pending litigation. Fulton
Yeah.
County had already said, fine, you can have them. It's going to cost you $400,000 to reproduce them. They didn't, to photocopy them all. They didn't like that answer, so they came in and took them. And to be honest, they probably, as you said, high burden of proof, they probably won't get them back. And then they'll always be able to point to, well, we have these, but we're not allowed to use them or go into them. And so it was more noise. I mean, at the end of the day, it
Yeah.
was more noise.
I mean, and that's why election officials feel so burdened right now, is because
Right.
they've always looked at the federal government as, at worst, a silent partner in
Right.
elections, and now the federal government seems to be an active antagonist, kind of delegitimizing their work. I'm going to ask one more question because it's kind of self-serving, and then we'll wrap up because we're at 12:58. How can lawyers, including non-litigators, best use our skills to protect our elections starting now? I mentioned EOLDN.org. I think Joanie might have put the link up in the chat. It'll be in the follow-up email. If you're a lawyer, and you'd like to help, we have recruited a network of about 10,000 lawyers all over the country who are willing to serve pro bono and advise election officials. And on the EOLDN.org website, there's a button on the lower left that says lawyers, you can volunteer here. You just go into our database. You're not agreeing to represent anyone at any point in time. You're not committing to anything. But what that means is when we have an election official in your jurisdiction that you're qualified to represent, and we might need someone, we might reach out to you and see if you're available. And we are very proud of the fact that we almost always pair our election officials with a qualified attorney in their jurisdiction within about 1 to 2 business days. And we're going to keep doing that kind of work. So hopefully that's one way that you can do it. Paige, do you have anything else on the lawyer thing?
Not on the lawyer front for any of those of you who are not lawyers, or if you are lawyers and you want to participate in an observation mission here in the United States and Montana, Michigan, New Mexico, Nevada, or Georgia, please go into the Carter Center website and sign up as an observer. We're looking for people. We need bodies, and if you live in one of those places, it would be great to have you.
That's great. Thanks. Joanie, I think we'll wrap up, but I'll just end. Paige, thank you so much for joining me. We could,
Of
like, this was,
course, of course.
often we're like, oh, can we fill an hour webinar? And we could go like another hour just chatting with each other. But it is, I'm really grateful for your partnership and leadership in this space and the Carter Center's work.
Thank you. Well, it's great. I'm learning from you every day. Talking about being disappointed. I worked at USAID for 2 decades, so seeing the demise of that agency and thinking I'm doing international work and now finding myself doing domestic work, I think we're all in this together. And I thank you for all the work you're doing and being a good teacher for all of us. So thank you, David.
That's so kind. Thank you all for joining us. We've really enjoyed it, and look for notice about the next webinar in this series. As Joanie mentioned, we'll be starting to plan it very soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.